Okay, so today's lecture looks at um, the impact of imperialism across the period that we've been looking at, right? So we've been looking at the late 19th century, roughly around 1850 onward. And what we've been examining here is a lot of what do the Europeans do to the people of Africa and India. And I think that's a good way to look about it. However, one of the things we need to look at too is what are the benefits that the Europeans give to the people of Africa and Asia or India. Now, I am not going to argue that what I have said is wrong, right? I think the treatment that the Europeans give to the people of Africa and India is atrocious, particularly King Leopold's killing of 20 million um, people in the Congo, the sort of cultural annihilation in places like Algeria by the French. So I think those are narratives that are certainly important. But I do also want to point out here that the people in these colonies, um, people in India and people in Africa, do see some benefit and they have their own agency. And what I mean by that is they're not just people who things happen to, they do things for themselves. They make alliances, they make treaties, they make um, business enterprises. So it's important for us to notice that the Europeans, although certainly manipulative, um, are also part of this larger, or I should say, and although, yeah, the Europeans are manipulative, and although the people of Africa and Asia are treated poorly, they are not always treated. They do have agency and they do things on their own. So let's look at, and I will also talk about the negatives here too. So let's talk about the impact of imperialism. One of the things that happens, so we're going to look at positives and negatives. One of the things that happens is that there is reduced local warfare. And the large part of that is because the Europeans basically become the enemy of everybody. So when you have the British or the French or the Germans or whoever coming into Africa or India, local tribes and local areas can't fight with one another anymore because the whatever hatred they have towards each other is now created problems by the British or whoever up the food chain. So what it's important to notice here is that there is less fighting within India and Africa at this time. The other part is that there is better opportunities for a lot of people within Africa and India. Through Western education, they can receive the education that the white Europeans are receiving. And this gives them opportunity for great social mobility. So if you look at some places like, if you look at a guy like Mohandas Gandhi, right? The person who becomes very important to Indian nationalism and Indian independence in the 20th century, he is, his parents, or his father I should say, is a member of sort of the middle upper class of Indian society, who if he didn't if Gandhi, Mohandas Gandhi, never left India, he would have been fine. However, through his connection with the British, he's able to go to Oxford or Cambridge. I think Cambridge. Anyway, he goes to England, gets educated, and then comes back. He goes to South Africa for a bit and is a lawyer in South Africa. He then goes to um, um, back to India, and then obviously leads the Indian nationalism movement, right? So what you see here is there's a lot of benefit in terms of abilities once you're a part of this sort of British world. Sort of connect, the next two are connected, right? Improved sanitation in hospitals, schools, and so on, right? Europeans are coming and they're bringing with them education, they're bringing with them hospitals, they're bringing with them healthcare, certainly to help their own people, right? To help the British who are there, but as a sort of side effect of that, the Indians get that benefit too. So I think it's important to see that there's sort of a two-way street here, or at least a benefit being given to them. We're going to talk about female economic autonomy in a little bit. That's one of the slides below. But it's also important to see that there's infrastructure, right? And I'll draw your attention back to the slide that I put up a couple of days ago, right? Yeah, these railroad lines that are put in India are certainly for the benefit of the British. But what is important to see here is that there are railroad lines that are completely funded by the British and there to support, and Indian people can get on it, right? So there you go. Now there are certainly negatives too. There's loss of autonomy, right? You, as a tribe, you may have hunted in Africa. You may have hunted on this one piece of traditional land for 100 years, thousands of years, but now that's being taken away by the British or the French or whoever, and you're losing that right to move. So what happens is, for a lot of groups, and I hope you remember this, a lot of people in India, or excuse me, well, India and Africa are tribes. They move around with the seasons. They're maybe not necessarily nomadic, but they may certainly be pastoral people, and I hope you remember that from earlier. Well, what happens then is, when the British or the French or whoever come in, they're saying, no, you have to stay where you are. Thinking about sort of, the Europeans are thinking about their own nationalist models of states in Europe, where we have boundaries, we have structures that keep people inside our borders. That may not exist, or did not exist, in a lot of parts of Africa or India. So now it's happening, right? The other part to this is that there's less resistance. Europeans, because of densities, because of population densities, because of lack of sanitation for so long, have a lot of diseases. They bring these diseases into parts of Africa and India that had not really had that much exposure to it. So there's increased disease. I brought this map in here because what this shows you is, and it's very tough to read, especially on a small screen like this, but there's all these different national groups, or at least ethnic groups in Africa, excuse me. And when the Europeans come in, they put in all these borders, right? So what you have here are ethnic groups of Africa, are the different colors, and then you also have the boundaries up until 1914, right? So what you see here is that these boundaries do two things, and that's sort of the third and the fifth point. One, they force people to stop moving. They force people to have certain, let's call them national identities. That's not necessarily 100% true, but more national identity. But the other thing that they do is they lock groups of people together who may not have been close allies, right? So one of the things that happens as a result of this is you draw these boundaries and you lock maybe competing groups together, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. The other piece to this, because of power, the Europeans break up sort of traditional families, and they break down sort of marriage groups and things like that. All right, so let's talk about access to education. We've already talked about the Western educated elites, and you've done some work on that. But I want to talk a little bit about schools that are brought in. Because of paternalism, because of Europeans feeling that they were superior to different different indigenous groups, they bring in education. So they bring in missionary schools, they bring in religious groups, particularly Protestant religious groups, like the Methodists and the Baptists, bring in their own groups of education. They bring in their own schools to establish facilities to quote unquote civilize the people of both Africa and India. But what's important to notice here is that the benefit is also, there is benefit for the people of Africa and India. They have literacy. And that can't be understated, right? Being able to read, write, share ideas is an important thing, right? Because if I feel something, but I can't express it to you, or I can't express it further than somebody who can hear me, well, those ideas are going to stay local. But if I can write something down and send it, now I can get more people to agree with me. And one of the things that's going to happen here is because of this literacy and because this access to education, people of Africa and India are going to start having a nationalist identity because I can write something and send it away. And that'll certainly have impacts in the 20th century. Um, Jobs are open to people of Africa and India. They can get jobs in these different firms. The other part to this is, and this is, breaking down traditional cultures, people of Africa and India start to adopt European culture. So today, places like Egypt, in North Africa, India, play a lot of British or French sports, right? Um, Algeria, Egypt have major soccer teams and soccer leagues. India has cricket. So you can see that the sort of British, French, European culture goes across the world because of this, right? And there's also another piece of this, right? I know, particularly in Egypt, in North Africa, the British move a huge amount of troops there, and the troops want to play soccer. They want to be able to have a game of soccer. So they start to teach the Egyptians that they're working with, they start to teach them soccer. And what happens as a result? Well, the Egyptians start to get good at soccer, and then they start competing in sort of a league. So again, there are unintended consequences. For women, there's a positive and a negative here, and I guess that's sort of the story here, right? There are positives and negatives. For women, there is a massive negative. Before European society entered Africa and India, many women had massively important jobs, not just raising a family, but breaking ground, planting seeds, cultivating seeds, working the fields. So before Europeans, women in Africa and Asia had huge and very significant roles as producers. When the Europeans come in, they force sort of European identities, and they stop that traditional, let's say traditional is tough word there. They stop the treatment that non-European women used to have, and they force sort of the more domesticated role traditional in Europe. The other part to this, and this is maybe a little contradictory, but because of access to the larger empires, women now could be producers, and their work could go across the globe. So women could, produce beads and other articles that could go across the globe. So now that their commodities could be sold everywhere, they are making some real money. We have a lot of relics of this up until today. Imperialism is not just something that ends in the 1960s. It's still things that we see today. If you remember back to a moment ago, one of the things I mentioned was that they put groups of people together that may not have historically liked one another. Well, the impact of that is that when the Europeans leave, you now have two groups of people who have historically not liked each other, and one group gets power, and it's usually not good for the other group. So you have things like the Rwandan genocide and the genocide in Darfur a couple of years, 15 years ago, in the early 2000s. So you have these major internal political problems. There's a reduction of African. There's a reduction in traditional languages, traditional cultures, because of the assimilation of European culture. However, when Europeans leave in the 1950s and 60s, there's no real education structure, right? There's no universities and no colleges that are still there. The last thing I want to talk about here is in the United States. The United States also is experiencing, although the United States is not something we've talked about really, I want to point out that the United States does have imperialism of its own. The empire, at least in the early 1800s, is trying to get the rest of the continent, sea to shining sea, right? So you have John O'Sullivan writing in the 1840s about this is our manifest destiny. And then you obviously have photos or paintings that illustrate that. And then the later 19th century, it spreads to other parts. All right, so that's European imperialism. I hope this all makes sense.